everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight. On behalf of the Institute for Women's Leadership and the Men's Development Institute, I welcome you to the conclusion of the 4th Annual Gender Summit. My name is Michelle Ozanich, and I am the Student Director for the Institute for Women's Leadership. This year, we are proud to put on our biggest gender summit yet. This week was packed full with research ranging across disciplines such as history, literature, political science, communication, theology, and more. It has been a phenomenal week, starting out with a screening of the documentary, The Mask You Live In, then an allied training, and most recently this afternoon, with our wonderful student and faculty, we had presentations. All of this excellent gender education that has been happening this week, it is almost impossible to imagine that there is yet more to come. A huge thank you to the student director for the Men's Development Institute, Taylor Carlson, as well as Magnolia Ditzler, the Feminist Social Justice Coordinator for the Institute for Women's Leadership, and Lincoln Mullings, the Institute Development Coordinator for Men's Development Institution. So then we just have a quick housekeeping for you before we begin with our keynote speaker. There's going to be a brunch that will be held tomorrow morning, and it will actually feature Andi Zeisler, the keynote speaker. That will be from 9:30 to 11. So if you're interested in attending, please contact anybody in one of the red shirts that you see standing around the room. Now I have the pleasure of introducing this evening's speaker for our 2017 Gender Summit, Andi Zeisler. Andi is the co-founder of Bitch Media, a long-time freelance writer and an illustrator. Andi's work has appeared in numerous places, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Ms. Mother Jones, The Toast, and the LA Book of Reviews. She is also a former pop music columnist for the San Francisco Weekly and the East Bay Express, and also contributed the anthologies of The Young Wives' Tales, Secrets and Confidences, The Complicated Truth About Women's Friendships, and The Howl, a collection of the best contemporary dog wit. She is the co-editor of Bitchfest, 10 Years of Cultural Criticism from the Pages of Bitch Magazine, and the author of Feminism and Pop Culture. Her new book is about the consumer co-optation of feminism, We Were Feminists Once, which was published in May of 2016 by Public Affairs. She speaks frequently on the subject of feminism, media, and pop culture at various colleges and universities. Andi has come here today all the way from Portland, Oregon, to discuss with us the feminist analysis of pop culture in a talk entitled Don't Change the Channel, Why Pop Culture Matters to Feminism, Activism, and Social Justice. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce to you Andi Zeisler.
Thank you. Hi. Wow, thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's really great to be here. So let's see. Yeah, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the work I do and the work that Bitch does. Just so I get a sense, how many of you have heard of Bitch Media? Okay, so that's like a few people. So I should go ahead and explain who we are and what we do. So Bitch.
Can you speak up too, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. I totally forgot that.
Thank you.
I'm going to move my computer over here. All right, does this work? Is everyone? Okay, cool. So Bitch was co-founded about 22 years ago in 1995 by 3 of us who were high school friends and had just graduated from college. We wanted to do something useful with all the time that we spent consuming popular culture, reading magazines, watching TV, thinking about how gender is portrayed in media that we, grew up with, that was surrounding us. My co-founders and I were part of the first generation of American kids to grow up with the feminist revolution and things like the queer rights movements in the backdrop of our lives. And yet, when we looked at popular culture, we didn't necessarily see it reflecting the changes wrought by those movements. And it actually seemed to us that media and pop culture were sort of moving backward instead of forward in how they represented and stereotyped, women and men and sex and race and gender and power. And we wanted to talk about it, but we didn't just want to complain, we wanted to figure out why these representations seemed so at odds with the real world that we saw around us. So our mission in starting Bitch was to look at media and popular culture as a site of feminist inquiry and analysis, and to encourage critical thinking that really centered feminist and social justice analysis. So over the past 21 years, Bitch has evolved to become a quarterly magazine. We have a website that is updated daily, lots of content there. We have a podcast called Propaganda that comes out twice a month, but we also have a weekly podcast, a bi-weekly podcast called Back Talk. Propaganda is the only one with this cool dog graphic, though, so that's the one I'm showing you. And then we have Bitch on Campus, which is our campus program where we send speakers to campuses like this, and we also work with professors and gender studies and communications departments to bring articles and materials from Bitch into the classroom. So, as you might imagine, we get asked about the name all the time, constantly. So I'm going to talk about that. When we started the magazine originally, we were really aware that calling it Bitch was a risky choice because, especially at the time in 1995, Bitch was still considered, like a naughty word across the board. It was, it had very recently stopped being one of the 7 words that you couldn't say on TV or radio. It wasn't something that you heard in sort of casual usage the way you do now. But we felt really strongly that there was a case to be made for reclaiming the word bitch. Because the word was and still is most often used to describe not necessarily, a mean-spirited woman who wants to do other people harm, but simply a woman who is saying something that people don't want to hear, or someone who stands up for herself or asserts her ability to say no. So to even publish a magazine that pointed out instances of sexism in media and pop culture, we knew that was going to be controversial enough at that time that we'd be hearing the word anyway. So it kind of made sense to us to get out in front of it and kind of turn it into something else. So yeah. And bitch has been an insult since at least the 15th century, which I did not know when we started Bitch. But it wasn't until the early 20th century, and specifically the first wave of American feminism, that it began to be used in the way that we're now most familiar with it, as a way to sort of scold women for attempting to transgress the bounds of, appropriate femininity. So for that reason alone, it's worth reclaiming. But my experience over the past 21 years has been that having the word feminist in the magazine's subtitle has been at least as controversial as having the word bitch in the title. Because like I said, bitch has become part of our cultural lexicon, for better or worse. But feminist is still far more understood as a term, as a concept. And even as feminism has become increasingly a part of the public identities of celebrities and other public figures, it's still very much associated with the stereotypes that were created by media and pop culture in decades past. And in fact, much of the contemporary public discussions around feminism over the past 4 or 5 years is still really mostly focused on making a case that feminism isn't as bad as people think it is. A lot of the celebrities, for instance, who have been hailed as feminists are hailed in large part because they are perceived to depart so strikingly from the sort of conventional wisdom about feminists as being, mean and man-hating and ugly. So a lot of what they're doing is making feminism palatable to outsiders, which can be good, but is still a very reactionary dialogue in many ways. But one thing that we did talk about a lot when we started Bitch was the importance of sort of changing the way that people thought about feminism and activism and using media and popular culture as a way in. Again, in 1995, feminism was not part of the mainstream of media or pop culture or feminism. This was, well before blogs and social media, so there wasn't even the kind of, reach that sort of standard feminist concepts got. Feminism and feminist movements were still very much associated with actions that happened during the second wave of feminism in the late 1960s and the 70s. And, that's still true. A lot of people still do see feminism as a kind of finite moment in history. And a big part of why it remains so relevant now is that so much of what earlier feminists pushed back against were, stereotypical images of women and men and gender and sex. And those things still exist. They might look different, but they're no less prevalent. So I want to start by talking about, why it's important to think about media and popular culture as kind of sites of feminist inquiry and activism. Across American culture, but certainly in other cultures, how we talk about gender and power and representation is really entwined with how we consume pop cultural products. Pop culture and media are incredibly central in forming our impressions of and our beliefs about the world, particularly when we're young. The movies we watch, the sports we follow, the books we read, the music we listen to, all of these things come to form parts of our identity and how we represent ourselves to the world. And so it's crucial to take pop culture seriously and not think of it as something that's separate from, so-called real life, but instead as something that both reflects and informs that life. When my co-founders and I first started Bitch, there were three of us, Lisa Jervis and Benjamin Shaken and myself. We ran into a lot of opinion that was sort of along the lines of, it's just pop culture, it's just entertainment. It's not supposed to be real, so you shouldn't take it so seriously. Just change the channel. You don't have to buy that book. You don't have to buy that magazine. And what we have always said is that it doesn't really matter whether or not we personally, as individuals, consume this media and pop culture. What matters is that it exists on a massive scale, that it's bought and sold, and that it has, throughout history, had demonstrable effects on who we are as people. I'm just going to throw out some statistics about media influence on children and teens in general. And a lot of these numbers have not been, are from, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And if you think of how much media has changed in 3 or 4 years, probably all of these things, like the number of ads that children see, these numbers have probably increased drastically. Okay, yeah. And then about 10 years ago, there was a report that was released by the American Psychological Association's task force on the sexualization of girls. And it was the first study of its kind, and it found that sexualization of girls, and what they meant by sexualization is the sort of encouragement for girls to see themselves as objects, and the cultural encouragement to see them as objects. That sexualization starts when they're, as young as 2, and that those images have really have significant effects on the self-image and development of girls, and by extension, how they relate to other people in their lives. The report looked at the consequences of early sexualization, its impact on girls' development of their identity and their self-image. And what was really interesting, because people are often talking about how important parental and family influence is, they found that whatever these girls learned at home and at school about their potential to be, leaders and self-sufficient individuals and not objects, those weren't the ones that got through. The ones that penetrated were the media and pop culture messages about women and girls as kind of passive, sexualized objects of desire whose main role in life was to be attractive for others. And so, now we've got the not only, exponentially growing advertising images and images of women and young girls across all forms of pop culture, we also have the prevalence of social media usage. And it's in this realm where sexualization has not only intensified, but more and more young people are taking cues about self-presentation from social media culture. So that kind of goes into the next subject, which is the subject of media literacy and how media and pop culture actually work, and the mechanics by which they encourage us to sort of literally buy into narratives. So media literacy is the ability to understand and analyze media texts like movies and television shows and advertising. But it's also the ability to sort of understand and analyze the context in which they are created and marketed. When I learned about the concept of media literacy in college, it was really a light bulb moment because I started realizing just how much I personally used popular culture to define who I was as a person. How I experienced the world was, and how I found friends and made connections was really based on things like books and music and the camaraderie around the things that you like. And this was the time when it also first occurred to me that the people who created the pop culture that, I loved or that I consumed, these were not people who were like pure and omniscient and, above the human condition. They're people with biases and imperfections who were putting forth their own views of the world in the media they created. So let's take The Bachelor as an example. Because in a way we kind of have to. I mean, it's been on network television for more than 15 years. It's consistently been one of the top-rated shows across particularly female demographics. And reality TV in general puts forward some of the most kind of regressive stereotypes about women and men and beauty and race and love. But The Bachelor in general is kind of, it's sort of like the epitome of that. And why it is so sort of culturally tenacious is because the stories it promises are so simple and so recognizable. It targets women by using, the language of fairy tales, references to princess narratives. Contestants will often reference, having a pretty woman moment, or, feeling just like Cinderella. And so in that language, constructing the text of this TV show, they attach a context to it that otherwise wouldn't be there. When you have contestants talking about, I'm living a fairy tale, this is my dream come true, or even using words like journey and quest, they are creating a context that is attractive and attaching it to the concept of a show, which when you think about it, is kind of sleazy. This language is deliberately feminized to make the story appealing to women because, a lot of women wouldn't see, having a date with a guy who's also dating 23 other women attractive. But it works. It really works. I'm going to throw a few more statistics at you. These are statistics on how media and pop culture really lean on gendered narratives. So, 56% of TV commercials aimed at female viewers use beauty as a product appeal, and we'll talk about that more a little later. 80% of characters with jobs in children's movies are male. There was also a recent study of children's books that found that central characters in children's books, both human and animal, are disproportionately male. So very early on, we tend to be conditioned toward women as secondary. And the thing is that this kind of myth-making is invisible to us as consumers of media and popular culture. Movies and children's books and TV shows don't come out and announce, hey, guess what? We're only showing men in positions of power because that's what people are used to. They do these things as a matter of course, and that's why they're so powerful. We simply believe those stories because those are the stories we have all grown up with. And most of the time, there have been few alternatives. There's probably no better illustration of the gendered construction of stories than advertising, which, for as long as it's been an industry, since the early 19-teens, it's actively sort of pushed to highlight and emphasize gender differences as differences in values. And we've seen how these stories have evolved. These are some ads from the mid-20th century that showcased men as superior and women as subordinate, which was, standard operating procedure. And, we think that we're a much more enlightened world now. But if you look at a lot of current ads, they continue this pattern in sort of less overt ways. So in this one, for instance, these static gender roles, you're not going to see something as obvious as a man stepping on a woman's head. You're going to still see, though, the suggestion that woman is a kind of other who's not necessarily human and who has to be conquered in order for men to be real men. Excuse me, I'm going to get some water. I have to be honest, I'm still not sure what this advertisement is for. I think it might be furniture, or is it a club? No, it's a salon. It's a salon. Okay. And then if you saw Magnolia's presentation earlier, you saw at least two of these ads. One of the biggest themes in advertising has always been women as sexual prizes for good consumers, for men who buy the right product. And these three are a drop in the bucket of what's actually out there. In many cases, this attitude has sort of crossed over into, occasional sort of casual suggestions that, sexual violence is the normal and the even necessary result in interaction between men and women, particularly in ads for alcohol. And there's a scholar named Jean Kilbourne who has done extensive work on this, if you're interested in the links between alcohol and advertising and sexual abuse. Another very familiar story that's been crafted by decades of advertising is one that tells women that the most important thing they can be is beautiful and sexual to others, because that is where their value lies. And again, these ads and the suggestions and the language may not be quite as overt now, but it is still indelible. Even campaigns in the last couple of decades that a lot of us tend to think of as sort of more forward-thinking and more, encouraging of non-traditional beauty standards, still end up emphasizing that beauty itself is really a paramount virtue for women and girls. The Dove campaign for Real Beauty is one of those campaigns that really uses a kind of bait and switch to suggest that, beauty can be a lot of different things, but it still ends up pressing the conclusion that beauty is the desired goal. And then, the most sort of ghoulish iteration of this beauty ideal is that, a woman should aspire to be beautiful and desirable even when she's dead. So that's fun. Learning to read ads and branding and marketing is a really easy route into media literacy and a really great way to understand how American capitalism in particular depends on maintaining a narrative of a gender divide to sell products. And this has become increasingly pronounced in recent decades. 40 years ago, there were no girls' diapers and boys' diapers. There were no girls' Legos or boys' Legos. There certainly were no gendered earplugs or yogurt specifically branded to men and called Brogurt, because apparently regular yogurt is too girly. I don't know. So advertisers and marketers increasingly appeal to this idea of like biological determinism, that men are one way and women are another way, and there are these two poles, and that's it. They create this gender divide, and they exploit consumers' anxiety about breaking that binary, and that allows them to sell more products. Just one effect of that is that children become unnecessarily conscious of gender at ever younger ages and are more susceptible to gender stereotypes and assumptions. I have a 9-year-old son, and when he was about 3, he wanted to be Spider-Man for Halloween, and we went to Target, and I was Spider-Man for Halloween, when I was probably his age, and it was literally like a printed plastic sack with a mask. And the current Spider-Man costumes are like bulked out with this kind of foam rubber musculature. So you have these like little boys toddling around looking like the Hulk. That is fairly new in terms of branding and marketing. It has not always been that way. You see ads that sort of very, again, in this very sort of low-key, casual way, code children. He's the little scholar, she's the social butterfly. They're being put in these categories, and there's no suggestion that those are malleable. So one of the frustrating things of sort of doing this work over so many years is that there has been progress. There's definitely been progress. Like we've seen, interesting things happen. People take risks in terms of advertising, marketing, etc. And a lot of that has to do with feminism and feminist concepts being mainstreamed and brought into sort of cultural dialogue through, things like social media. But the flip side to that is that there's this idea that feminism has, as a movement, been completed. There's this idea that, because we're now able to work the same jobs as men, often be paid the same, but not always, because we now have institutional recourse for things like sexual harassment and discrimination, and because there are a good number of women in positions of power and influence. Because of that, there's this idea that feminism happened and we're all good. But that's not necessarily the case. And this tends to manifest in pop culture as sort of small gains followed by backlashes. Around the time we started Bitch, the word post-feminist was being used a fair amount in the media. And post-feminism was a concept that came out of academia and philosophy, and the idea was like, what happens after feminism? But the way that media and pop culture filtered that message and the idea of post-feminism translated as anti-feminism, as in against feminism. And so feminism's real life gains at the time I was growing up in the 1980s and 90s were really undermined by media and pop culture that presented them in a negative light. So for instance, part of the media's version of post-feminism was that feminism had actually worked too well, and it had hurt women, and women were now overworked and unhappy and unloved. They were starved for children. They were too scared to admit that what they really wanted was a traditional life of white weddings and husbands and children. Ads like this one for Wonder Bra sort of put forth the idea that if women objectified themselves, it was actually empowering to them. It was no longer sexist because they were sort of in on the joke. But as the media has kind of pushed this idea of post-feminism, real life for so many women has backslid into, not a post-feminist place, but an actually blatantly anti-feminist place. We are far from living in a post-feminist world as defined by the mainstream media. What we live in is a world where some women have gained some ground in quite a few areas. And that minimum of progress has produced a disproportionate amount of fear that women's rights and achievements pose some sort of threat to men, to the natural order, to the family, etc. And so, for instance, it's in this climate that state restrictions on abortion have skyrocketed in the past decades. It's here that the people who are deciding things like who has access to contraception and what counts as rape tend to be middle-aged white men. We have a president who, sees no problem in, taking meetings about how women's health will or will not be addressed in healthcare, having absolutely no women in the room to help make those decisions. We also have a president who has literally bragged about, mistreating women and disrespecting them and even assaulting them. We're in a moment right now where we are seeing the fact that there have been, for every sort of consequence of things like sexual harassment or assault, there are people who have been getting away with it for decades and who are now even more powerful than they've ever been. And in the case of Alabama's senatorial candidate, Roy Moore, in a place to make far-reaching decisions having to do with women's physical autonomy. The messages we get via media and pop culture are also sort of counter to this idea of a post-feminist world. Most young people growing up today are sort of raised to believe that the world they live in was transformed by civil rights movements, by feminism, by LGBTQ rights. But that belief rarely holds up under scrutiny. So here we see, for instance, that women are incredibly underrepresented as advocates and experts in national media, women of color even more so. If we live in a post-feminist world, why do tabloid magazines report almost exclusively on, the bodies of female celebrities, whether it's because they're overweight or underweight or pregnant or postpartum. If we live in a post-feminist world, why in nearly every profession where women and men do the same work, from factory workers to high-paid Hollywood stars, women earn substantially less than their male counterparts, and not only that, are much more likely to be penalized for questioning it or talking about it. If we live in a post-feminist world, why do women every day get rape and death threats after, expressing opinions about sports or video games online, or advocating for feminism or anti-racism, or simply being in a public space? If we are in this post-feminist time, why is it disproportionately women who are confronted with explicitly gender-related threats? So that's the bad news. We're not in a post-feminist world, which you probably already know. On the upside, media and pop culture still and will continue to be really excellent venues for responding to all of this. And I'm just going to talk about a few examples of many that sort of give me hope and serve as kind of a model for what's possible. The Twitter hashtag #OscarsSoWhite first appeared in 2015 because when the Oscar nominations came out, every actor nominated was white. And what #OscarsSoWhite did wasn't simply to complain about that, but to force the the Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences to be more transparent about how these decisions get made. So it was around this time that people actually started revealing that the Academy itself, the voting members of the Academy, were at that time 94% white, 76% male, 2% black, less than 2% Latino, and had a median age of 62. And that explained a lot. That explained a lot of why things were getting nominated and why certain things weren't. And so the #OscarsSoWhite hashtag really put out the idea that, yes, if you don't have diversity in the decision-making institutions that sort of drive our cultural products, you're not going to be making diverse products. You're not going to be reflecting the world that most of us live in. And so after the second year of #OscarsSoWhite, the Academy was really put in place where they had to respond, and they have. They've, reformed the membership, they've made pledges, and it might actually be making a difference. Also in Hollywood, there are watchdog organizations, the Gina Davis Institute on Gender in the Media. There's another yearly report called The Celluloid Ceiling. They make inequality increasingly obvious, again, forcing a kind of transparency that didn't have to exist before. And then because of social media and blogging, these findings can be disseminated incredibly quickly to huge numbers of people, and make people aware that these are things that are happening, and talking about ways to address them. There's a great blog called Native Appropriations, and the owner of the blog talks about how Native arts and culture is appropriated by multinational corporate brands like Urban Outfitters, and basically makes it clear that you can't just call something Navajo. You have to actually appeal to the Navajo Nation, which holds trademarks on the name Navajo, to protect the work of actual Navajo artists. And so, they were able to, for instance, get Urban Outfitters to stop producing these ridiculous panties. The trick about this, and the thing that I often have mixed feelings about, is the only way to make this change is to appeal to the greed of corporations and institutions. Wait, that's not what I wanted to say. Okay, yeah. Right, I don't think public shaming is necessarily the best way to make social change, but at the same time, corporations, institutions, deeply entrenched cultural producers don't do things out of the goodness of their hearts. They don't do things because it's the socially responsible or right things to do. They make changes when they realize it's going to affect their bottom lines. And right now, media and pop culture, consumers who want to push back on these things have a pretty limited toolbox. And public shaming, especially via social media, that draws attention to, sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia and all these things, that happens to be the tool that works the best right now. Saturday Night Live was shamed a few years ago for not having a single black comedian or writer, and they did something about it. Hasbro was shamed a few years back because they didn't offer Star Wars merchandise featuring Rey, who was the star of The Force Awakens, and people complained and they were shamed and they did something about it. So it's sort of like, it sucks, but it also works. And that's one of the things we have to use. But in general, and something we have always talked about at Bitch, is that one of the keys to really staying positive and conjuring up some optimism has to do with finding voices and finding subjects that you like and are passionate about, where your efforts can sort of bloom into media literacy campaigns or reform campaigns. I always say that feminism is serious, but engaging in feminist activism is also really fun. And that's always been one of Bitch's sort of core tenets. And we all know from, things like The Daily Show and Saturday Night Live and The Onion, satire is often the place where the jolt of recognition comes when it doesn't come from straight on reporting and advocacy. It's sort of the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. And media and popular culture have always been a really fertile place for activism and what's called culture jamming, which is the act of subverting the culture of consumerism by explicitly modifying it. So this is an example from almost 40 years ago. It's a British billboard for the Fiat. A more recent example is this fake Nike ad that, points explicitly to the fact that sweatshop labor is child labor and sweatshop labor is how a lot of Nike products get made overseas. And a lot of these projects really thrive because we do know a lot more than we ever did before about how our products are made, where they're made, under what conditions, who's exploited, who's shortchanged in those processes. One of my favorite, somewhat recent examples of culture jamming came from a British feminist collective called the Vagenda. And they invited readers to recreate sexist and sort of appearance-based tabloid headlines in a way that sort of shows how kind of overblown the original ones are. Sites like BuzzFeed have created videos that sort of put men in the roles usually occupied by women in advertising, like this one from Hardee's, as a way to point out both how ridiculous these roles are, but also how desensitized we've become to seeing women and girls portrayed as objects. There's a great Baltimore-based group called Force, Upsetting Rape Culture, and a few years back they did a corporate sort of culture jam of Victoria's Secret, where they created images of underpants with messages of consent. Now, Victoria's Secret at the time was selling actual underpants that had messages on them, but they weren't about consent. And so this kind of hack made people believe that the chain was taking on the issue of affirmative sexual consent with its customers. And it wasn't. And so that had a dual win. It put Victoria's Secret in the position of being like, no, we don't put images, we don't put words about consent on our underpants. And then it also prompted a lot of people to think about the messages that chains like Victoria's Secret or other chain stores are sending their customers. Even stuff that comes across in the media can be really helpful. There was a story a couple years back about how during Obama's first term, his female staffers noticed that they were being talked over in meetings, and that if they said something or floated an idea, it would be ignored, but then a man would say the same thing, and it would be like, oh, great idea, Jim. So they came up with this strategy called amplification, where the women agreed to sort of have each other's back and to make sure their voices didn't get drowned out. And they'd say things like, well, as Karen said, we should blah, 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 blah. Or, I want to reiterate, Marie's point. So these things are getting out there. We're seeing them more and more, and that normalizes it. That makes it, apparent that, like, we have all these tools. We can push back. We might not be, doing a corporate hack. We might not be defacing a billboard, but we can all take lessons from those actions. And this is where a complicating factor comes in. The one clear drawback to media and popular culture as an increasingly prominent locus of feminism is that it can be very easily co-opted. And that is what my book, We Were Feminists Once, is about. Feminism has become quite popular in the past 4 or 5 years, and some interesting things have happened because of it. It's a pretty recent embrace of the word feminist and the idea of feminism, largely credited to Beyonce's 2014 performance at the MTV Video Music Awards, which set off a kind of domino effect wherein feminism almost overnight became something that people saw as aspirational and desirable because they saw Beyonce embracing it as part of her brand. So this is a graph of what Twitter looked like in the 24 hours after Beyonce performed, and you can see that, Google Trends showed a massive spike in the numbers of searches for Beyonce feminist, which I don't think it's I think it came out too tiny to read. Anyway, shortly after that, Emma Watson gave a speech to the United Nations on the importance of global gender equality. Chanel's runway show finale in Paris Fashion Week took on the form of a feminist rally. Brands like Verizon and Always began building ad campaigns around the subject of empowerment, specifically girls' empowerment. And suddenly the media was filled with headlines that sort of rushed to proclaim feminism kind of the new thing. But more often than not, appealing to feminism and feminists became another way to sell products to women. Advertising for decades has sold products to women by sort of appealing to their sense of shame. Their dishes aren't sparkling clean, their skin doesn't glow, their babies have diaper rash, etc. But as feminism has sort of crept into the mainstream, advertising has been one of the main places that has kind of jumped on board to reap the rewards of flattering women rather than shaming them. Getting back to the Dove campaign for real beauty, at the very start, this campaign actually had pretty radical potential. Their ads pictured a really wide range of women of all ages, sizes, colors, actively confronting the expectations of viewers. But as the campaign has gone on, it's become both more normative and more insistent on kind of shifting the weight of cultural expectations back onto women themselves. And so what I mean by that is, you know, Dove's not, it might be the most recent viral ad, but anyway, they had an ad recently that the hashtag for it was Choose Beautiful. And the idea was, you know, these supposedly real women were walking into an office building and were confronted with these two doorways. And it was like, which one are you going to walk through? And the tagline for the campaign was, beauty is a choice, and the power of this choice is in your hands. So Dove went from sort of purporting to reframe beauty itself to then scolding women for kind of absorbing the societal messages about beauty standards as though they and not the advertising industry were responsible for it. You know, an entire system that values some skin colors, some body types, some sizes over others can't be dismantled by choosing to buy a product from, you know, a global corporation and calling it empowering. That's just not how it works. And ads that link buying products with feminism or women's empowerment are generally doing kind of the bare minimum. This was a 2015 ad for Ram trucks. And all it did was acknowledge that women drive trucks. And this ad won something called a Femvertising Award from a digital lifestyle media company. And that's it. You know, this is something that the advertising industry is congratulating itself for. It's not a world-shaking revelation that women drive trucks. It's not a world-shaking revelation that, you know, women can exist successfully in bodies that aren't a size 2. It's not, you know, a revelation that women can believe themselves to be strong and capable. But when an industry that has made its money shaming or erasing women suddenly stops, at least on some level, doing those things, we call that feminism, and we urge women to make feminist choices by choosing to buy those products. The sticking point for me is that the commercial embrace of feminism hasn't really changed the fact that feminism as a political and social movement is still one of the most contested subjects in political and social life. The question of, you know, whether women are human, whether women deserve to have the same rights and liberties and opportunities as men, is still posed nearly every day in politics, in the workplace, in schools, online, with very, very different answers than what these ads would suggest. And the aspects of feminism that are sort of currently given voice in pop culture tend to be the least complicated ones, the least political ones, the ones that for the most part center on what we know to be the status quo, heterosexual relationships and marriage, economic success that doesn't challenge existing capitalist structures, the right to be desirable yet have control over your body. These are all great, but there's so much more that feminism has yet to do. And so it's important that people invested in feminism use its current popularity as kind of a means to an end and not the end itself. So I'm going to wrap this up, but we're at a really interesting and kind of pivotal place right now. The fact that so many people who have huge cultural megaphones, like Beyonce, like Emma Watson, whoever, these people have made feminism part of their brands, and you know, the positive side is that they are able to bring a critical mass of attention to feminism and gender equality in ways that, more than a century of women's movements have not been able to do. But the negative part of that is that when you make feminism part of your brand, you have to make it as palatable as possible to the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. And what that means is generally stripping the complexity out of it, the intersectionality out of it, the politics out of it. The idea behind what we do at Bitch is that speaking up and responding to the forces that shape culture is a really worthwhile form of activism. Because we've seen that when people who create our pop culture and media are thinking critically every day and are willing to put progressive and challenging content into the world rather than relying on old formulas, it really can translate into change. And one way to do this is just to simply start thinking more critically about the media and the pop culture you're already consuming. And that can be really scary. I mean, because then you're admitting to its power. I know pop culture and media have, innumerable flaws. And yet I love TV, I love movies, I love music. I think advertising can be an art form. And I know that pop culture, probably more than my upbringing or my family or my formal education, has really shaped my sense of self and my views on the world. And when you actually stop to think about that, that can be really terrifying. And that's why I'm really passionate about others not being afraid to speak up. I've seen a lot of terrible media and pop culture over these 21 years, a lot of stereotypes, a lot of insults, a lot of real harm. But I've also seen it become more interesting and more diverse and less stereotypical and more reflective, again, of the real world that we live in. We need to care about pop culture to make it better. We need to not dismiss it as just entertainment or as just fantasy. And so my hope is that the people who are invested in media and pop culture, as fans, as creators, as analysts, will continue this project and continue to try and make it reflect a better world, a smarter world, and a fairer world. And I hope at least some of you will be part of that. Thank you all for coming.